pretty good start, so does Jimmy B. Coleman, so does Chris Coleman. Coleman's leading it, and Bolt's going to chase him hard. He's not going to catch him at the moment, but here he comes, and Coleman's still got the lead, and Gatlin wins it!
As the crowd boos two-time convicted doper Justin Gatlin in the defining moment of his career, they rightfully echo the sentiment that we'll never trust a sprinter again. Of the top 30 fastest 100 meters ever ran, only one athlete has never been convicted of doping. When I first heard that Irish sprinter Steven Colvert vehemently denies his convicted use of EPO, I rolled my eyes and thought, of course he does. They all do. That was until last year, when 4 Norwegian biologists independently published a paper questioning his results. They stirred up some controversy when they concluded that the only fair decision was to drop the case against Colvert. To detect synthetic EPO, there must be standing above this blue horizontal line. Here are 8 athlete samples. Notice they all have at least some standing above the line due to natural spreading. 7 of these samples are negative. Here's a positive control. Do any of them match? Colvert's is lane 15. The Norwegian scientists aren't convinced this isn't natural spreading. I needed an independent opinion, so I went and asked the man whose reputation is beyond reproach. This lane number 15 is his, and they said that's a positive result, when to me a lot of the negative results seem to look about the same.
So does this.
That looks positive or negative to you, number 15?
Negative.
A WADA scientist, not one who was involved with the original arbitration or evaluation of Steven's case, wrote a response in which she actually agreed that Steven had committed a doping violation, but at the same time agreed with the Norwegian scientists that the original interpretation by WADA of the drug test had been incorrect.
So here we have a situation where we have one athlete and 3 opinions on the science. I'm not an expert in EPO, but I can tell you that 3 opinions on one scientist is not the sort of thing that a solid conviction is based on.
That in itself is a pretty strong example that the evidence in the case confounds even the experts who are supposed to pass judgment on it, raising real questions about the fidelity of his conviction.
Most concerning is when they retested the same sample using a different method, they found wildly different amounts of synthetic EPO and illogically chose not to repeat the test, meaning the data used to convict Steven was unconfirmed.
One method said that there was just a little bit. However, the second method suggested there was an enormous amount.
If we had obtained those results in our lab, I just asked the student or the person who got them, how did you manage that? We had to repeat those results, but the WADA lab did not repeat it.
Can you give any explanation for the discrepancies between the 2 tests?
No, certainly not. I don't understand that's the same sample that is analyzed.
I mean, the most obvious explanation that the second test was spiked in order to pass that test. That's the most obvious. I'm not saying that's the case, but the labs should be asked that question. And if you cannot get a credible answer, a good and credible answer from the lab about that, they should dismiss the whole case. In general, they're a good lab, but this is not the first time I've seen problems with a clone sample. I think they must have seen it. I mean, if they didn't see it, they're not competent. I could show you 20 cases like this. Lots of them.
How do you explain that?
The people don't know what they're doing.
Then your evidence has to be rock solid, airtight, because you are in effect ending an athlete's career. In the fullness of time, it is pretty clear, I think, to anyone who takes a look at the evidence that there are some really problematic issues associated with Steven's case.
One such issue is that Steven did not receive raw data. These results from a different athlete show the unprocessed versus processed images. Confoundingly, Sport Ireland claimed to have given raw data in the same sentence as admitting it had been processed.
In science, we need to show raw data. They don't, and Steven Colvert received the answer that this is the raw data. That's not true.
That's completely unacceptable behavior. And it's ironic that labs and people that are testing athletes for unethical behavior behaves in that manner.
I may perhaps now conclude that I am even more disturbed and shocked by these organizations who should work for clean and fair sport and do not contribute such that we can obtain the final answer.
Dr. Scotland is also referring to the fact that this case could be easily resolved by just retesting the samples. However, Steven's samples were destroyed even after his request to store them at his own expense. This is confounding, as even negative samples are stored for 10 years in case future tests can retroactively catch dopers. As these tests could likewise be exonerating, it seems WADA fears any scrutiny upon their science, even if it means innocent athletes suffer.
Because now Steven Colvert's in the situation that he has to prove his innocence. Well, how does an athlete prove his innocence if his sample's been destroyed and all you have are dueling scientists out there?
It's manifestly unfair because certain athletes don't have the financial or political connections it takes to defend themselves.
So I think this case points to some of the shortfalls in due process for elite athletes.
Some athletes are going to be harmed because they're not going to be able to defend themselves against unfair accusations of doping. But that's the sacrifice we're willing to make in order to clean up sport.
Compare Maria Sharapova and her ability to argue against her conviction with Steven Colvert, who my understanding is he's not quite at the level of Maria Sharapova in terms of his endorsements and so on.
EPO is an endurance drug that provides little benefit to sprinters. In fact, only 2 of 213 dope sprinters were banned for only EPO, the others taking it as part of a large cocktail of expensive PEDs. The doping scandals at the upper tier of sport are only possible due to vast financial resources. Steven was a law student from a humble background who had never even qualified for the Olympics. It seems unlikely he could afford such treatment when the only expert he could afford during his hearing was unqualified, and sadly, very ill.
Steven had the unfortunate situation where the expert he had retained to defend his case was not really an appropriate expert. He was an expert but not an anti-doping. Part of that was because of resource constraints that Steven had and an inability to get the top expert. But tragically, his expert died the same day that he gave testimony.
Their human rights are completely denied. I mean, they are, if you're an athlete, you're guilty until proven innocent. It's not the other way around.
You can't say, well, we've got 95 athletes correct and 5 of them wrong, because if you falsely accuse 5 athletes, that's 5 athletes whose careers are probably ended, and the consequences are pretty significant and tragic.
For example, the case of Paulo Puego, who missed Rio from a false positive test, even as hundreds of doped Russian athletes were allowed to compete. WADA is well aware mistakes can happen in any lab, but if by their own admission they only catch a small fraction of dopers, one must wonder if they feel pressure to produce results, and if lower-tier athletes without political and financial resources suffer the consequences.
Yeah, to show that they're doing something. But WADA is very open about the fact that they're not very successful at what they do.
Anything less than 100% success is a problem.
The minute WADA admits a failing in their system, that creates a precedent that every other doper in the world goes, see, you blew it here, we should be off the hook too.
A person that is found guilty, who's actually innocent, you can destroy their life.
It really is their single voice yelling into a hurricane that is the long history of doping in sport.
It's hard to build a system that's perfect on both sides, that's going to get all the dopers and still protect, the innocent athletes at the end of the day.
And the public is extremely skeptical, with reason, because so many athletes have doped and always will continue to dope, that a lot of times their claims of innocence turned out to be bogus.
The evidence does not prove that he's innocent, but it does not prove that he's guilty. I mean, I think I have to dismiss it.
The first question you ask is not, is Steven guilty or innocent? The question is, did he achieve due process and was the doping conviction legitimate? And it's a subtle difference.
The athletes deserve a lot of skepticism, but so does the anti-doping industry.
I mean, for me, the fact that her defense of WADA, number one, she introduced evidence that wasn't used in the arbitration hearing. She went to a different staining image and brought that in, and then she contradicted them on the amounts. Boom. That's all you need to know. I mean, as far as the due process question. But getting people to understand the difference between due process in a conviction and truth or falsity.
For those athletes who really are clean and have been unfairly accused of doping, they are not in a good situation because there's very, very few people who want to stand up for their interests.
We don't get any money. We're doing this on free time, but I also, in a way, feel I have an obligation. I mean, we know how these tests function, and we disagree with them, and I think we should say something about it.
You know, who knows what the final Wikipedia entry will be for Steven Colvert in the end, but I think at this point there's sufficient evidence out there for anyone who looks and wants to spend 10 or 15 minutes reading about it, that there was an injustice done in this case.
It angers me and it saddens me, and to a certain extent I can accept the views people are going to take because they're putting their blind trust in the IAAF and WADA that they're going to do the right job, and in this case it didn't happen, and it just deeply saddens me. It's a huge toll on my mother and my grandfather particularly. It definitely aged him. Like he's an older gentleman, he's almost 90 years of age, but he never looked it until 2014. My mother worried sick constantly. She was worried about me if I would potentially self-harm, given the situation I was in and the circumstances surrounding. But it was terrible. There's no place in sport for it. It's absolutely ruined the sport. Even just last night, Justin Gatlin won the men's 100 meter final. Should he be there in the first place? Absolutely not. So just.
People might call that hypocritical coming from you.
Absolutely. Call it what they want, but there is no room for doping in the sport. And realistically, if it's a case that I have to leave the sport or, my career is completely done, but it ultimately betters, something is learned from this, I could maybe accept that if it's not going to happen to someone else, I'll take that brunt, you know what I mean?